So, hi everyone, we are ready to start. I am Cecilia Rikap. Welcome you all to UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I am Associate Professor in Economics here and also the Head of Research. And with the latter hat, I've been curating this research seminar where we have been inviting prominent young scholars like Robert to present the work they are doing. And what has been guiding this research seminar, it's our aim to promote and broadcast young scholars that are doing or engaging with big questions and working on these big questions or ambitious projects towards books. So it's a research series where we are hosting book launches. And last September, I had the pleasure to be at the Berlin Social Sciences Center, and I met Robert in person, and he told me about the book. And since then, and when I started thinking about this, I would say that it was the other way around. It was because of your book and Ana Carolina Cordila's book, who I will comment on this later on because it's the next one that is coming, that I said, we really need to host a series of book launches with young people, because what usually happens is that we think that only very senior scholars can take the liberty to write a book, whereas I think that we should be bold and engage with these research questions throughout our career. And also because in particular, the content of the books that are discussed in this series are extremely relevant for IIPP's research topics, policy engages. I couldn't think of a better opportunity or occasion to invite Robert. So after just giving you this brief intro of where we are, let me just introduce our session today. As I anticipating, we are hosting the book presentation of Dr. Robert Gorwa's new book. He is a senior research fellow at the Berlin Social Sciences Center, and his book is entitled The Politics of Platform Regulation. And I want to read the subtitle because I really like it. How Governments Shape Online Content Moderation. I think that I don't need to say much about the topic. It's been, and it still is, a highly topical and relevant issue, not only for scholars, for policymakers, for people working on no matter which discipline or engaging in no matter which sector. And this is also why it's becoming so important. It's no longer just about a few platforms related to entertainment or social media. It's really everywhere, transforming every aspect of our lives. And we not only need to understand better how they work, but also how they are being regulated or insufficiently regulated, and what can be done or what could be done differently. So for this discussion, we will have the pleasure to listen to Robert's book presentation. And after that, I will give the floor to Marisol Manfredi, who is doing her PhD on sustainable development and climate change at the University of Pavia and the University of Pisa. It's a joint diploma. And I met Marisol while she was doing a master's on economic policies for the global transition, and super also related to the core of what IIPP does, which is trying to put together rigorous research on that is at the frontier of topics that we believe are should be addressed and tackled not only from us as scholars, but also from the political sector and broadly from society. So I'm very glad to have also Marisol here commenting on Robert's book. And the format will be a very classical one. We will give now the floor to Robert, then Marisol will give some comments, some minutes back to Robert, and maybe depending on where we are on the time, I will make a few comments or questions, and after that we will open it to all of you here and also to the people online. So thanks everyone for joining us today on a Friday afternoon. I'm sorry that my voice is the worst today, and the floor is yours, Robert.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Cecilia, and the rest of the colleagues at UCL, Ismini, and the rest of the logistics team for being so on the ball and so organized in organizing this event, and to you all for being here and for the invitation. It's a real honor. Let's see if I can get this clicker to work. Yeah. So, I mean, you joked at the beginning that young people are writing books too, and I don't feel young after writing this because it was a 7-year project and it almost killed me. But we're here, and I'm really excited to be able to share some of the insights from this big project that I've been working on, first in Oxford and now in Berlin. It's coming out with OUP in July, and it's also going to be open access. So if these are topics you're interested in, please check it out. I would really appreciate it. So I'm going to shoot to talk for like 25 minutes. I'll start by just giving you a little bit of a framing and background into this topic that I've been working on, this question of what actually is platform regulation or platform governance, and what does it look like as a policy area of study. I'll tell you a little bit about the book, so the research questions, my method, and the kind of case studies that I was looking at. And I think I'm going to give you then a little bit of just my overall arguments and conceptual framework and tease some of the case studies that I develop in the book. But because it's relatively short and it's a pretty long book, despite my best efforts, we'll maybe not go into extreme depth in the case studies and try to get that a little bit in the Q&A. So let's start with some background. So whatever you want to call it, in the discipline that I'm working in, which is this kind of interdisciplinary technology policy space, there's a lot of different terms and jargon that are basically thrown around to talk about the same thing. Some people call it content moderation, some people call it trust and safety, some people call it platform governance. But the core of it is that major technology companies with different business models are governing online spaces in various ways. And there's a lot of literature around this from different kind of disciplinary perspectives and backgrounds. Media studies scholars have been for some years looking at the kind of affordances and design decisions of different platform ecosystems and architectures and how those have a big impact on the way that we use those spaces. A kind of more policy-oriented and legal-oriented set of work in the last 5-6 years has been looking at the way that companies, especially ones that operate infrastructures for user-generated content, so social media, the types of platforms where you are uploading stuff and that is being shared publicly, how those companies have to basically create bureaucracies for managing rules, for managing speech, for managing content. And once you create these bureaucracies, we're seeing increasingly sophisticated kind of socio-technical systems of policing and enforcement of those things. So I don't know if this text is dark enough for you to see, but this is just a flavor of some of the different policy areas that are covered in Facebook's community guidelines. Things that are not permitted on Facebook and things that they are actively seeking to detect in the content that you post, whether it be an image, video, audio, whatever multimedia format. So it goes from classic issues for internet policy and regulation like spam and fraud to kind of more newer debates around misinformation, disinformation, online safety, violence, criminal behavior, what have you. So another thing that I'm sure is not going to be news to any of you is that as more and more people are kind of learning about how these systems work, more and more policymakers in particular are becoming kind of annoyed with how these systems work, the lack of information that is available about their functioning, and the often kind of arbitrariness of the decision-making that platform companies have been developing in recent years. CEOs have been called to testify in Europe, in the US, and many other countries, and policymakers are upset, rightfully or wrongfully, often rightfully, for all these different reasons. Hate speech and harassment, mass shootings, child sexual abuse material, the list goes on and on. So my book is basically jumping into this moment where more and more governments are interested in doing something that I call platform regulation. So if we think about content moderation, trust and safety, this system of rulemaking and enforcement that I talked about, platform regulation is the way that governments try to intervene and shape that system. So they try to basically get companies to change their behavior, to design the rules in a different way. The formal definition I have here is that it's a process through which government actors are trying to shape the design, architectures, policies, and practices of platform companies around the capabilities, use, and affordances of their services. It's a mouthful, but in effect, it's about trying to shape what companies are doing, what big internet multinationals are doing in the realm, I guess, of online safety. So this is a fast-moving and super, super big and complex policy area. And I think there's at least 4 major categories that touch on what platform companies do generally. I might be missing something, but in the book, I look at least 4 broad categories of law, of policy, of regulation. Data protection, content regulation, platform labor, so online labor platforms, Uber. Again, some people dispute whether or not these should actually be called platforms because they have such different business models, but let's sidebar that for a second, and competition policy. And even within one of these areas, there's a huge amount of kind of sub-policy areas. And what I think that's interesting here is that in the last few years, each one of these sub-policy areas has kind of become a transnational regulatory regime with its own civil society groups, its own stakeholders, its own kind of multilateral and multi-stakeholder policy networks and institutions that are engaged in kind of trying to shape corporate standards on these types of issues. So copyright is probably the best established and oldest one, and is actually the one that I don't go into any depth on in my book. There are key third parties like the famous Hollywood's rights holders that have been really effective in shaping internet regulation and the way the internet works on copyright for a really long time. More recently, we're seeing kind of constellations of policy actors emerge on a lot of other issue areas as well. Violent extremism, hate speech and incitement, disinformation, the governance of sexual content, the governance of child abuse imagery. So the motivation for the book was basically to say, okay, we're seeing a growing amount of state-led, as well as some kind of interesting, weird, hybrid, multi-stakeholder policy initiatives that are trying to intervene in these different policy areas. But so far, pretty much everyone has been studying them from a kind of legal perspective. In the UK, for example, you have the Online Safeties Act. When I first moved to the UK in 2016, I remember there was a green paper that DCMS had developed, and there was a multi-year process of consultation and development that eventually became the Online Safety Act. And there's been a lot of great work, especially from legal scholars, which has been analyzing the Online Safety Act, its implications, critiquing it, what it means in practice for this ecosystem. And this might be slightly less true now. It was definitely true when I started writing the book, that there was very little research from a general social science perspective that was looking more at the kind of politics behind the scenes, looking at the policy drivers, the types of negotiation that were shaping these policies as they were being developed. So the questions that I started developing in the book were these kind of how, where, and why questions. So how, where, and why does platform regulation emerge in different jurisdictions? What are the political factors that are shaping the development of these types of policies in different places around the world? And how do we explain differences in the strategies that different governments are developing? Assuming that, yes, local contexts are very different, but these technologies in many ways, the companies that operate them are global, and the effects are being felt in many, many places. So in short, I'm a public policy and regulation scholar, so I'm not just interested in kind of black letter law and formal regulation, but I'm also very interested in informal regulation, which has been probably actually the defining mode of how big kind of political actors like the European Commission have been negotiating and kind of cajoling big social media companies, for example, to try to change their policies on these kinds of issues for the last 15 years or more. Governments can use informal modes of regulation, establish complaints channels. They can leverage their access to policymakers inside industry through their own kind of contacts. They can threaten sanctions or service disruptions, threaten to block the services in certain ways to try to get companies to do stuff. There's a kind of semi-formal mode of regulation where policymakers are working collaboratively with industry. And again, these are really big and in many cases very well-resourced companies. And there are new types of policy forums that bring together different types of actors from civil society, from government, and from industry to try to shape standards around these various areas. And then finally, there's also the kind of more costly but potentially the most effective part of this toolbox, which is like binding law and traditional regulation that is enforced by state authorities. So someone who was very kind enough to read an early draft of the book said that your conceptual framework needs to be alliterative. And I had, I think, a P in there. It was like persuade, collaborate, and contest. So now I have 3 Cs. That's, you know, my rigorous typology of different regulatory strategies in this space. And these map on basically to the informal, semi-formal, and formal regulatory strategies. So convincing in this space is something that happens all the time. Lawmakers, I mean, there are some well-known anecdotes of presidents, of heads of state calling up the head of a company, of calling up Mark Zuckerberg and saying, hey, we need you to take this down, or we need you to change your policy around how you're policing this specific issue around our election or something. So here you're not actually doing any intensive policy effort, but rather it's more of a kind of back channel negotiation. Critics in civil society call it shadow regulation oftentimes, because again, this stuff isn't happening in the public eye. It's potentially not necessarily accountable to democratic oversight. Policymakers go and they use carrots and sticks, and they negotiate with companies to try to get the changes they want to see. You also see a lot of collaboration now. So the EU has been a leader in this for a long time, where their approach has involved basically bringing companies to the table and you know, often with the threat of sanction, saying, hey, we're going to work together and we're going to develop a code of conduct. It's still going to be non-binding, but you know, we want you to change the way that you police disinformation or online hate speech. So there were 2 big efforts that grew out of something called the EU Internet Forum in 2015. One was the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation. One was a Code of Conduct on illegal online hate speech. So these are really interesting because these are ways that policymakers, through a softer tool, are getting companies to change their rules globally. So, you know, European policymakers impact how Facebook's rules on hate speech are applied globally in Argentina and Brazil, all sorts of jurisdictions. And finally, you have contestation, which is my alliterative term for classic regulation, where governments are basically trying to layer new rules on top of the status quo, what industry is already doing, and these are binding rules that are enforced by regulators or state authorities in some way. You can have fines. So what kind of motivated me to look at this area empirically, to maybe just step back one step, was that we were starting to see a lot of governments intervening in some of these different issue areas, from online hate speech to disinformation, with really different tools, including sometimes when they said that they had the same stated policy goal and they wanted to do exactly the same thing. So I developed kind of 3 very, probably too detailed, process-oriented studies of how some major policy intervention in the space were developed. So I started in the EU with the German NetzDG, which some of you might be aware of. It's called the Network Enforcement Law. It, of course, has a really long and unpronounceable German name as well. And this is probably the first binding regulatory framework which deals with harmful content online that's like politically and socially harmful. So not copyright, not economically harmful. And the story I tell starts in 2015, around the time of the so-called migration crisis and the Syrian civil war, and in the context of a hotly contested German domestic political election, where a lot of lawmakers were really dissatisfied with the way that content, especially xenophobic content, was being dealt with by major companies. So they started by developing a voluntary code of conduct, and that was abandoned after 2 years in favor of this law called the NetzDG. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there because I have set this up so there's a nice teaser for the next slide. A year and a half later, some of you may have heard of the Christchurch mosque shooting, which was conducted by an Australian, happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, and really kickstarted this very charged policy conversation about the governance of live streaming and also online extremism, radicalization, white supremacist terrorism. And what's interesting about this case is that this shooting, where two countries with very close social, economic, and political ties, trying to respond with the same objective of getting companies to increase the amount of resources that they would invest in trying to police this kind of stuff, led to two very different policy frameworks being developed. So in Australia, in record time, I think in less than a week, they drafted a new law and pushed it through the legislature, which really reformed the liability regime for platforms. The kind of high-level takeaway, the headline element was the Attorney General of Australia saying that CEOs of platforms could be found personally criminally liable and be imprisoned if they didn't get their house in order. But in New Zealand, they did something very different where they worked in this more kind of international collaborative diplomatic tradition, working through the G20, working with the French and other countries to build this kind of collaborative effort called the Christchurch Call. And we can get into this later, but what's interesting is that arguably this effort had a huge international ripple effect because it led to the formalization of something called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which is this organization that operates a hash database. So I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but pretty much now, anytime you post anything to almost any online service, whether it be a cloud hosting service like a Dropbox or Facebook, TikTok, what have you, the stuff that you're uploading, text, images, video, is being scanned in the cloud, and they're taking a cryptographic fingerprint of it and matching it to a list that is run by this organization called GIFCT of confirmed violent extremist videos, imagery, and content. So this is something that has been happening in the last few years and has really changed the game for automated content governance and automated content scanning in the internet economy. The last case study I look at, and I have a funny story about this, I'm really happy I researched this study. It wasn't exactly the most scientific process of case selection. It was more my editor being like, you have to write about the US because otherwise no one is going to read this book. Thankfully, by then, when I was reworking my PhD and into this book, a lot of action started happening in the US, including a number, I think by some count, several hundred state-level bills that have been introduced in state legislatures that are also trying to intervene in this space through various ways. And what I think is interesting from here, I'm interested in policy change and in political institutions, and all three of these different case studies succeeded to more or less different degrees, despite really strong institutional obstacles. So there's some disagreement about this, but amongst legal experts, and actually also people that I talked to at the European Commission, it's pretty widely agreed that the NetzDG is illegal under European law and shouldn't have been permitted to go into effect. And the EU has as you all know, a project of legal harmonization. That's one of the main goals of the EU. And they have this digital single market strategy and various mechanisms for the review of technical regulations, which basically allow them to veto member state regulations in the case of incompatibility with EU law, as was clearly the case in this example. And yet, for some reason, this mechanism was not used, and the law still went into effect in Europe. And it set up the Commission to legislate on its own 2 years later with the Digital Services Act, which many of you may have heard about, which in the explanatory memorandum justifies the need for new harmonized rules in the EU by saying there's now been legal fragmentation because Germany and other countries, France, Austria, have done their own laws. In Christchurch, the institutional hurdles are maybe a little bit weaker. The biggest thing is just time. They managed to pull this off in an incredibly short period, and there was only one more sitting of their parliament before closing for an election period. And both countries, again, we can maybe connect to some of your work, Cecilia, in this question of power and digital capitalism. Neither of these countries is considered to be, a massive regulatory superpower in the way that the EU is. They're smaller markets. industry doesn't seem to really have mobilized in response. And both of these frameworks went into effect in some way. And similarly, in Texas and Florida, which are the two states I write about, as well as California and New York, which were blue states that had some other interesting stuff going on as well. You know, Americans in the audience know that there's extremely strong constitutional protections for private expression, and through some quirks, which we can, you know, debate how good or how problematic they are, social media companies, like many other companies in the US context, are considered private actors that host basically private speech and have wide remit to do what they want with that in their privately controlled and managed spaces. So it's also not really contested that the types of laws that lawmakers are trying to pass are unconstitutional under existing legal frameworks in the US. Okay, so I'll start wrapping up. But basically, this is just a flavor of what I did in this project. So I did a lot of interviews with stakeholders involved in all three of these case studies, policymakers, both elected and not, civil servants, etc., civil society, and also people in industry. And I guess the most fun thing that I did was that I filed a lot of freedom of information requests. And I started trying to get internal deliberative documents to try to better understand the types of decisions that were being made by the policymaking entities when they were developing these laws. So I'm looking at a very micro level and just basically tracing out in these chapters how these laws progressed, who were the main actors driving them, and what were the kind of negotiations and trade-offs that were made in the implementation. So through FOIA, for example, I know that the European Commission has some really, it's very nice of them to release these documents and not redact them, has some very interesting things to say about the German law, for example, and the internal deliberations around whether or not they're going to intervene or not were super fascinating. And in the end, again, I don't think I have time here to really walk through all of these case studies. But it's very interesting because basically Germany manages to leverage its power in the Commission, its contacts in the Commission, the Germans that are in high-level positions, to make this argument that because of the incoming election, that an intervention into this law would be potentially a costly political defeat at home and could be intervening in the electoral landscape. And instead, they were informally able to negotiate some concessions to the German law, which is also interesting because it was much more effective than the industry lobbying and the civil society campaigns that were organizing against this law. So yeah, that's the data. The book isn't out yet, but if this is interesting, I'd love if you had a look and have a look at these different case studies. My argument kind of comes down to this, which is that through these different case studies, I'm looking at these kind of supply and demand factors, which I think impact policy development in this space. And part of it is basically a function of what I call political will. So it's the demand side factors that are driving policymakers to be willing to absorb the costs of doing these types of regulations. The question of whether or not, you know, they are willing to resist lobbying efforts from industry, resistance from civil society. And then also this question of power to actually do those rules once they have the sufficient demand. And that's really a question of regulatory capacity, executive power. So a lot of my argument is about the specific features of domestic political systems, which gets kind of underplayed in this space. It's kind of boring. It's not that exceptional in terms of what differentiates this type of policymaking from any other types of policymaking. But it also makes sense. If you're under a Westminster-style system where you win a very strong majority in parliament, it's much easier for you to pass legislation in a place like the US, which famously has like the worst legislative gridlock ever. And it's almost impossible due to things like the Senate filibuster, it's impossible to pass regulation at the federal level without bipartisan support. So that kind of explains why, for example, the only areas that you can see movement on this issue is on areas like kids' safety, where they're able to form this kind of weird coalition in the willing between Republicans and Democrats. It also explains why the states, where I think as of last count you have like 36 states that have these trifecta governments where one party controls the governorship and both sides of the legislature, they're passing all these bills. So I write a lot about the kind of, I guess, concerted institutional battle to change also the norms through the judicial system and through the legislature at the states, change the status quo around this types of policymaking in the US. So the main, I guess, takeaway here, I think, and the contribution that I'm trying to make in this book is just to advocate for a politics of platform regulation, a politics of digital policymaking. And, you know, I think we would do well to be more interested in these really boring, maybe to some weird wonks like me, interesting realities of domestic policy in different systems. And I guess the way that they occasionally interlink with international politics, with multinational companies, with kind of more established features of global governance of international relations. And, you know, this isn't shocking since I'm not a legal scholar, I'm more of a policy scholar. But I think it's just it's not only about the law, quite clearly. We need to start thinking more about the political features of this landscape of digital policymaking. So salience shocks, there's a big theme that runs through the book about crisis events and how that mobilize certain types of change and empower policy entrepreneurs in certain ways to get the type of change they want. Regulatory capacity, executive power, veto points and how they're designed. And yeah, I end with a kind of argument for more empirical work, both qualitative and quantitative, that tries to understand these dynamics in different contexts and also in the global comparative context. So that's just a high-level overview of the book. I hope I wasn't talking too fast. I have a tendency to do that. But yeah, please, once again, you can pre-order it now and just check it out online if you're interested.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have something written because if not, I start talking and then I lose my, I lose the way. So I am delighted to be here to discuss the politics of platform regulation by Robert Gorwa. This book navigates the interesting landscape of platform regulation, offering a very comprehensive look at how various jurisdictions across the globe approach this governance of digital platforms. Robert, you have methodically unpacked the dynamic interplay between policy drivers, political dynamics, and institutional frameworks that shape this difficult platform regulation realm. By focusing on different case studies, you have provided a very nuanced understanding of the factors that motivate governments to intervene in this digital space. Platform regulation is indeed a complex and dynamic policy field, and in your book you provide kind of a toolkit, if we want, that could be used to look a little bit more widely at also other technological policy areas in the platform realm, but also beyond. Personally, I really like how you ask the why and thereafter the how of a very interesting phenomena that I think it's interesting to us, to everyone, no? This new asset that we call data that actually govern our daily, everyday lives. And as an economist, as a social scientist, I also like to peel phenomena as if they were onions, no? Like try to explore the underlying layers of the reasons behind this policy making. I don't know if you have read this book, someone in this room, Freak Economics, the very first one, where Red Levitt wrote that the difference between philosophy and economics is that while the first one studies the morality, so what is wrong and right, or what should we consider the good and the bad, the second science, economics, accepts moralities as it is, as it's given, and in the exercise of putting ourselves in the positions of observers, of third persons, try to ask the why of that wrongs and right, the whys of this good and bad. So why this or that phenomenon happens? We are social scientists, are full of tools and kits and softwares, which are also computers and platforms, that allow us to play with variables for understanding the deepest reasons. And I'm not just talking about econometrics here, if there are some economists here, but actually I really think that we should invest efforts on learning a little bit more on qualitative methodologies. So coming back to the topic, Robert, your book has really took me to a very interesting journey of understanding a little bit better this new phenomena, which is the digital space and the politics embedded. And as I said before, and this is not as an economist. Of course, I am interested in what Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and its nuances as a user, as a naive part of this complex and difficult gear. So what is new in this status and virtual system that we are all part, and how have happened so fast that it's around us right now? A topic that you very well introduce, recognizing its complexities, its multipolarity, and its various ways of approaching it. Your book also, it's really clear. There is a beautiful taste of history, but it's clear and complete crucial analysis for the present moment. It's very dynamic. It provides a toolkit picture for assessing and understanding the platform government's main drivers. When I say history, it sounds funny. It looks like for the virtual world and the digital realm, history is only 2 years ago. Because things are changing at such a fast speed that only few of us are perceiving these changing forces of the societies and how our relationships are changing, how these powerful new structures such as big tech set the new rhythms of our societies. The instantaneity that has brought the data and the possible infinitive imaginable possibilities that it has opened definitely possess interesting opportunities as we social scientists. Are we living a similar moment that the one Adam Smith lived also as a philosopher first, in which the forces of not industrial this time, but digital revolution is changing how society is structured and superstructured? Saying this, I want to thank you for the importance of your book. I personally believe that it's fundamentally important, again, that thinkers of our days take some moment to analyze what is invisibly happening in our daily lives and the new forces that govern the way in we relate. As Illich said, digital is inserted in every choice architecture, and it is fundamental how you explain in your book that platform governance is not merely a technical issue or a legal issue, but a deeply political one. Your book also brings to the light the complex relationships between platform companies and the states, and how these relationships influencing the broader socio-political, local, and international landscapes. Also, I think that writing and studying platforms in general needs courage. I say this because as the very first definition of platforms that you mention in the book, I'm going to quote it, platform is a system that can be reprogrammed and therefore customized by outside developers or users, and in that way adapted to countless needs and niches that the platform's original developers could not have possibly contemplated, much less had time to accommodate. So it needs courage because as a researcher, you have to allow yourself to imagine, to predict, to envisage a future landscape, use and dispute of these new black boxes things that we are creating or are being created. So these new gatekeepers kind of are influencing what we buy, what we see, and why not, what we think. So I think it's very important to put some effort on understanding them. So now, my questions to hopefully engage also the audience in this very nice discussion are the following. So I know that in your book, you throughout your book, in the different case studies, you analyze the different power dynamics between big tech, let's say, of platform companies and states. But I would like to insist a little bit and know your opinion on where specifically, or maybe when specifically, do you think the power balance between companies and states regarding the digital space changed? Do you see here a more general decline of the state power in favor of big multinationals, such as we can mention the unsuccessful TRIPS waiver campaign with the COVID pandemic-19. So this downgrading of the power of the governments to control and regulate big companies? Or do you see that this is a product of the advance of capitalism, or do you think that when it comes to platforms, there are specificities that turn the willpower to companies? A second and a similar question, in my current PhD project, I am analyzing the innovation dynamics behind big agro industry. And a problem I can clearly see is that there doesn't exist an international global agreement in regard, for example, the regulation of toxic substances, such as glyphosate. Maybe this is the most known one. And if there are some, such as Montreal Protocol or Stockholm Protocol, they are very soft and usually they are not respected by country. If I try to translate this into the climate crisis, I also see not so much compliance from countries in regard Paris Agreement, for example. So in this scenario, do you see any possible collaboration between states across the globe to come up with an international regulation of online content? Or do you think it's absolutely impossible, or do you think it should be developed locally? And finally, another question that took my interest was, it was very interesting in the book when you describe how the political demand is being created. No, what happens inside these policymakers that finally they decide to intervene in the digital realm. And I would like to know your opinion about what happens with grassroots movements advocating for regulating platform economy. Why there are not so many grassroots movements in the world saying, okay, let's regulate this? And if you think that they indeed exist, what do you think it's the mechanisms that they can implement, being the fact that we are so immersed as final consumers inside this? A controversial case I can sit here is the watermelon for Palestine, but this is kind of like my question is going. How, as final consumers, can we engage on this? And just the last question, sorry, but your book was really interesting. You mentioned that in the case of Germany, the NetzDG, and I hope I am pronouncing it well, was profoundly shaped by the negotiations with the European Commission. I mean, you already said it, but it would be very nice, at least for me, to understand a little bit more how this process worked, how the European Union influenced the German law, and if you also think that the European Union can actually ensure to all its member states that are very diverse legally and culturally, to have a digital single market online regulation, and if you think that it's actually good that there is a corpus of different states trying to regulate big multinationals, or actually it's more complex because of all these particularities that they have. And Mary, if you just want to say something about this, because I think your book provides a very good, as I said, toolkit, but also theoretical framework to understand what is happening in the digital space. So if you could apply your theoretical approach to what has been happening with ChatGPT, and these all artificial intelligence, new technologies that we are having. For example, in Italy, I remember ChatGPT was banned for some time, and Pisa GTP appeared. So if you have some saying on how artificial intelligence can also be analyzed within your framework. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marisol. Now we give you the floor.
Sure.
Maybe if you can make it 8 minutes or not more than 10. Yeah. And then I will open it to the audience, and I will leave my questions eventually till the end, because I think you already have enough with Marisol.
Yeah. Okay, well, Marisol, thank you so much for both the kind words and also for just reading with it so deeply. I think you and the two of you are probably the first economists who have read this. And the fact that you still invited me and didn't run screaming is incredibly reassuring. So thank you for that. I mean, oh my, yeah, there's so much there. Maybe I'll just try to dip in one by one. So one thing that I'm obviously interested in, and this is also the intersection with your work, Cecilia, is these kind of broader debates in terms of digital capitalism and I guess the historical juncture we're in, and also this question of power relations between companies, which again now are some of the most highly valued corporate entities in history. We could quibble on how that is actually measured and how many, what their actual concrete impact is in terms of employees and actual impact on the economy. But still, these are large, powerful multinational companies. and the relation between what they're doing and what governments are doing. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a little bit one that I cheated and I kind of hedged in this book, because I'm only really looking at the implementation and design of rules, but I think when it comes to power, the most important thing is application and enforcement, right? So if you take a narrow perspective and you just say, you look at the rules and you say, wow, well, like, you know, the EU is this regulatory superpower because they're now passing all of these laws, AI Act, GDPR, DSA, DMA, Data Act, DGA, platform to business regulation, terrorist content regulation, copyright directive. I mean, it's really staggering. I'm like supposed to be doing this as my job and I cannot keep up. And, you know, clearly, like everyone who's a critical kind of analyst of the GDPR will say, okay, well, yes, it changed the playing field, but the way that the enforcement was set up, and you know the way that it created regulatory bottlenecks, and Ireland is in charge of the enforcement for the whole EU, right? How much has that really pushed back against corporate business models and corporate power? So I think it's a really important question, and I sidestepped it partially because I think it's just too early. Like a lot of these policy initiatives are too just happened in the last couple of years, so we don't really know their long-term effects yet. I think in terms of like what the broader historical shift is, there is probably something to do with like this word that gets thrown around in media studies circles, which is platformization, and the way that the internet architecture has kind of shifted, where more and more politically important stuff, more and more governance is happening at the very top of this famous metaphor of the internet hourglass or the stack, right? So before, in the 90s or in the early 2000s, if there were, let's say, pages or blogs that were doing stuff that was super illegal, because of the way that the web protocol works, right? You can go and you can look as a government or an internet service provider, you can look at intermediaries and you can say, okay, block this website, block Cecilia's website. And you can't do that anymore because every group is sitting under the layer of the app, right? So you can't, as a government, say, I'm going to tell my ISP, I'm going to, you know, in Berlin, tell Deutsche Telekom to block this Facebook group, which is a neo-Nazi group. Because again, it's all within Facebook's architecture, and they basically, as a result, have to make the decision. So I think that's, the shift is something, and I don't want to be a determinist, but something about the way that more and more activity online, socially, culturally, economically, started getting sucked into the platform space. And also as they just became bigger and more popular. At the end of the day, we have semi-public spaces that are high impact that we all use, and in certain ways, at least because of that architecture, state power can't reach in the same way maybe it used to have. And I think that's probably at the heart of some of these issues, and that's why you have to regulate intermediaries. The second question about international agreements and rules, you know, I think in the same way that you mentioned, the same reasons why it's hard to find international agreements on a lot of the most tricky policy problems facing us today, I think it's going to be really hard to find global coordinated speech regulation, just given different preferences in different jurisdictions. However, I think we're already seeing a lot of collaboration that is less formal, right? And what you're seeing through things like there's after Christchurch, for example, they set up this Christchurch Action Network, which now brings together a lot of governments. There's a lot of governments that are in various ways working together, and if their goal is basically to say, okay, we can't touch what you're doing inside that app layer, but at least we want all the companies to have local expertise and some resources devoted to dealing with this in our countries, countries can band together and pressure companies together in a concerted way. And this has been long one of the most kind of existential critiques of the space, which is like, I think now, 20% of the users are in the US, maybe even less for many of these companies, but 90% of the resources in terms of safety are in the US, because that's where the journalists are, that's where the bad PR is, right? US and Europe for sure. So I think international collaboration around best practices and resources is already happening, and it's definitely feasible. Grassroots movements. I think this is also a really interesting question. I wished I could have gotten into it a little bit more deeply. There's a bit of literature looking at civil society specifically in the platform context, and there's this really kind of influential and maybe troubling paper written by the fantastically named Pepper Culpepper at Oxford, a great scholar of business power, and Kathleen Tellin, who's a political economist. And they basically make this argument that the reason why like consumer boycotts fail, and the reason that this isn't a high salience item on the public agenda, is at the end of the day, it's like, okay, this stuff is bad, but they're providing a quote unquote free service and they're popular with consumers. And their paper is actually about all the ways that companies have been really effective in policy negotiations and in lobbying of leveraging that connection in kind of some novel ways. So, you know, in Brazil, for example, there's been some regulatory reform around online content issues, and WhatsApp has been sending push notifications to people, right? No other company can do that. Nestle certainly couldn't do that in terms of directly reaching consumers and saying, hey, you need to tune into this debate. Here's a link to this live stream in Parliament. Also sign our petition. You know, so this is interesting. That said, I think especially on some issues and in some contexts where there's really strong civil society and maybe preferences are aligned on some issues, we are seeing interesting stuff. So like in Germany right now, the Pirate Party in the EU and some kind of digital civil liberties organization have been super active on this client-side scanning debate. I don't know if anyone has heard about it. It's around a draft counter child sexual abuse regulation that's happening at the EU, and it's basically become to another fight around encryption because the policy would mandate phones and apps to be doing some kind of on-the-device predictive analysis of your images and also of your text to see whether or not it is child abuse material, or more worryingly, whether it's like grooming material that could lead to future child abuse material. And those civil society groups have quite effectively been organizing about this and are basically saying, listen, this is a huge slippery slope. Again, everyone wants to keep kids safe, but like, you know, what's to prevent us from using the same infrastructure for national security or for other issues? Really worrying. So there are some grassroots movements, but again, I think the landscape is maybe fragmented, and it's not so easy to build these coalitions as maybe on other issues where harms are also a bit more tangible and clear. Very quickly, you know what, I think maybe we'll have to sidebar the whole stuff about the EU because I'm just going to start talking, and then I'll start telling you about the TRIS process and the veto points and the standstill and the technical regulations and how they're notified and how long it takes for each actor to intervene, and how this was like a really weird and interesting realm of politics, but it's a long story, but it's in the book. It's in the 5th chapter. I will just very quickly say there is some interesting, so I would love to do a bigger EU-focused project like I kind of rattled off. There's so much policy development that's happening, and it's really hard to navigate, also because a lot of it seems very contradictory. There's different goals, and I don't know how much of it is purely a materialist explanation where like it's literally just different actors in the commission that are doing different stuff with different agendas, but there's a lot of stuff, like for example this draft CSAM regulation I mentioned, which at least on the surface level, contradict with like the human rights values-oriented framework of the DSA and other things that the Commission are doing. So again, there's been some interesting work from scholars, especially legal scholars who are into this LPE movement, LPE in Europe, Law and Political Economy, who are critiquing the digital single market project and are actually saying, listen, this is part of the course for the EU, and we're tapping into broader debates about the EU and and its role as a order liberal or neoliberal economic actor, and the question to which actually one of the goals in the single market is in a weird way also deregulatory, because things like this country of origin principle, which have been baked into EU tech policy from day one, which is that you make it easier for companies to comply with regulatory burdens. They're only can be investigated in one jurisdiction. Again, that just inherently, according to these more critical scholars, there's someone, Rachel Griffin in Paris, for example, has a good paper on this recently. This is, potentially quite problematic from day one. And maybe just the last thing I'll tease, I haven't done too much work on this yet, and I told myself that it would never happen, but the AI pivot, it's getting us all. And I've started doing a little bit of work, which is actually looking at the intersection of platforms and AI development. And it shouldn't be surprising to any of y'all who have listened to this that it's kind of platforms all the way down. And there's new companies and new middlemen that are doing some really interesting stuff. and some weird stuff which have big safety and governance impacts. So I published a paper last year with a colleague who's at UCL actually, Michael Veal, really fantastic data protection and machine learning regulation scholar. And we look at these like new weird intermediaries that are hosting models, especially in the open source ecosystem. Platforms like Hugging Face, as well as more established ones like GitHub that have been hosting software for a long time. And we're looking at how, so in the paper we do case studies of how they have been trying to basically think of models as content. So what happens if we have some of the same problems that I've been writing about, but instead of just being an image that you're trying to figure out if this is okay or not, if this is illegal or not in certain jurisdictions, if this violates our norms of accessibility or not, it's a model. Maybe it's a dual use model that is really complicated and can be used in all sorts of different ways. And increasingly they're getting takedown requests from governments around certain models. And it's a very incoherent space. They have no idea what they're doing. And it's a hard policy problem. So anyway, definitely something I'm like trying to explore in future work.
Okay, thanks again, Robert. I'm going to now open it to the audience here before we go to the people online. So do we have any questions? Here.
Thank you. My name is Arif Zaman from Bloomsbury Institute, just around the corner. In your characterization, your 3 Cs, which I think is commendable, I was as you were going through that, I was thinking of a book that came out 20 years ago this year. And the title pretty much says it all. 20 years ago, it was a Financial Times book. The title was called Reputational Risk, How to Manage for Value Creation. Now, the interesting point was that at that moment, the link between reputational risk and governance was pretty weak. Now it has become stronger. And certainly in areas around gender equality, we're now seeing a number of companies learn to their cost. If they don't get it right on gender equality, it becomes a reputational risk. So my question is, around governance, and particularly corporate governance, do you see an emerging opportunity to sort of build a narrative around the need to address these kinds of issues from that particular perspective? And I wrote the books.
You wrote the book. Okay, perfect. I'd love to read it. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important and interesting point. I have a little bit in the book on the kind of legitimacy of different actors in this ecosystem, and I guess kind of how they're perceived in terms of reputation. And I think this has a big impact, especially in the international context that I'm looking at, in terms of like, who is going to work with who? And, part of my argument is that basically certain countries, for example, which maybe due to issues around press freedom or human rights are perceived in different ways, are going to have a harder time collaborating with at least the companies that care about their reputation in certain ways. But more broadly, in terms of kind of image-oriented corporate governance, I think we're seeing different companies invest in different ways, and some have been trying to navigate this landscape by branding themselves as like more responsible players. It's easier or more difficult for different ones depending on their business model, right? So Apple, for example, has had this argument around privacy for a long time, but they don't really host user-generated content other than in the App Store. So it's easier for them to do that than Facebook, which is this messy policeman that has to make millions of these decisions every day. The flip side is, of course, what happens if you're like, are we calling it X now, right? Where they say, we are firing, we don't care. We don't care about reputational risk. We're willing to make a bet that advertisers and these other players in the ecosystem, advertisers historically have been really big in this too. There's work, I don't get into it that much. We're willing to bet that they will stick with us and we will cut our trust and safety expenditures by 75% or more. So I don't know. I don't know exactly. I haven't done the analysis on where that is going to land these companies in a few years. I think it's interesting in the AI space that I just mentioned particularly. So some like Hugging Face are really pushing this kind of responsible brand, and they're trying hard. Again, I think there's maybe an issue where being a good corporate citizen in this case only takes you so far because some of the policy problems are just so intractable.
So, two questions there.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's so interesting. I was going to ask if I can ask 2 questions, but it sounds like we have so many in the room. I'll stick to one. In your analysis, did you find examples of governments rowing back and reducing the amount of moderation? I'm thinking particularly a concern here in the UK is the new Digital Information and Data Protection Bill that seems to be removing the restrictions on online advertising during elections. A lot of people are concerned that's the government essentially legislating to allow a Cambridge Analytica kind of misinformation election campaign, whether or not that's true. Were there examples that you found in your research of governments actually rolling back?
Yeah, no, that's a super, super interesting question, and I wasn't actually aware of this in the data protection bill, so I'll have to look into that. Not in a huge way, but definitely I would look at the stuff that's happening in the US, which frankly is very weird at the state level, especially. And I think part of that is that there's this weird bipartisan consensus that something, should be done, but the base preferences that are motivating that are pulling into two opposite directions, right? And some of this is just, I guess, core issues of politics and polarization, where in the US, they are, so especially in the Texas and Florida bills, but there's others, there's a tendency in these Republican states where what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to restrict corporate behavior. So they're saying, you have these policies, we want them to be looser, we want fewer of these moderation infrastructures because we're operating under a base political perception that these infrastructures are unfairly targeting us, right? And they're worried about conservative canceling. And you have these deplatforming bills, which are supposed to prevent companies from taking down the speech of political figures, for example. And meanwhile, in blue states, they're doing the opposite, where they're trying to increase the standards, and that's where you get this weird middle ground. So I don't know. I think, just quickly, I would say I think my argument and framework kind of holds. I don't think we see a lot of that, probably because the baseline in most of these issues is fairly laissez-faire as it is. So it's more layering up rather than down. But I think at the end of the day, the political dynamics are similar. If you really want to, there was one case in Malaysia where there was a law that then was repealed. So change of government. So again, if you build the demand and you build the coalition around changing the policy, I think at the end of the day, whether or not you're improving or lowering the standards, it doesn't matter. And what's interesting in that, I don't know what the data protection case will be, but in the US, the firms are also lobbying against this. They don't think it's going to empower them in any way, even though it's technically a lower standard. They're like, this is going to make our platform unusable because we're not going to be able to take anything down. Advertisers are going to leave. People are going to, it's going to be a mess. So I think in many ways, weirdly, the politics are kind of similar.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Do you mind coming closer, maybe? Because
Sure.
the mic is not on, it's just for the people online.
Thank you for coming to talk about your work today. I was curious, you mostly focus in the parts you shared with us here on like the usual suspects of content moderation. You also talked about how it's kind of platforms all the way down. So I was wondering if you could expand on if you covered any, less common platforms. Shopify is one that comes to mind for me, things that fade more into the background there.
Yeah, no, great question. So the case studies are mainly focusing around these kind of traditional big user-generated content platforms. But the first half of the book, I try to do like a policy mapping and a kind of overview of different spaces. And there I do touch on a lot of different platforms. So marketplaces, e-commerce, cloud, the online labor markets, so-called like locally tethered kind of gig economy platforms. I do a review of, it's a bit of a lost cause to try to be, up to date, especially on a book and how, long it takes to publish. But I think as of like late 2023, I have a pretty updated list of policy actions around those issue areas as much as I could. But I think, it's definitely not the focus in the work, and it's something I wish I could have developed a little bit more.
Thank you.
I don't know if we had also a question over there.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you touched upon this in your book, But another big issue, obviously, in platform regulation is in terms of design rather than just content. As much research has been done and uncovered the negative cognitive and mental health effect of so-called hostile design of many online platforms. And I would assume most tech companies would be resistant to changing their designs as their business models rely on it. So I wondered what method identified in your book, if any, you think could be effective for this area, and whether you think states even would have the political will, as you termed it, to do anything about these aspects of platform regulation.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I think, so the one major example that I touch on in the book, I don't go into it in huge depth, but there was a bill that was introduced in California, which is the Age-Appropriate Design Code bill that maybe you've heard of, which is also a very interesting bill because it's kind of spearheaded by this transatlantic coalition. There's a UK NGO which basically made a political decision that they're like, California globally is the place where we should organize civil society organization, movement to lobby for this specific bill. And it's super ambitious. It's all focused around design. And I would say the thing around design-oriented regulation, I'd say it's theoretically possible, but I just think it's enormously costly. And I think companies are going to resist it in a really serious way for understandable reasons, because if they're changing their business model or they're making meaningful changes to architecture and not just layering, investing a bit more resources or changing some of their policies or changing the processes around, I think these bureaucratic systems of content governance are softer and more malleable institutionally than the architectures, right? The underlying systems. And of course, they do change those systems in certain ways. But I think if you're going to mandate them to redesign services, I think it's going to be hard. And that's where I think you're getting the option that will always happen, right? Is and I'm not talking too much about implementation, but the politics we've seen that play out is that companies will just exit, right? So it's hard to, I think, get companies to stay in your jurisdiction and take it seriously, and they will threaten exit, they will drag it through the courts, they will do everything, they can to not have to do these very costly regulatory interventions.
I suggest we give the floor there and also there, and then I will move to the questions online.
Testing, okay. Hello, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask if you had ever thought about VPNs and the impact they have on a need for global governance. I don't know much about VPNs, but it seems to me like in vain for my country to try and impose different regulations from other countries when I could access the platform via proxy in those other countries. It kind of screams to me that VPNs beg the need for some kind of global cohesion. Have you thought about the impact that has?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good question as well. I think the flip side, to turn that on its head, would be, I wonder if more governments are going to try to persuade companies to disable access, right, for users in certain jurisdictions. And again, they can. There is VPN detection that is happening. This is always, it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. But I think the thing with VPNs, is that probably you're introducing enough friction that most lawmakers are happy about it? I don't know. It would be an interesting question. Like the extent to which, if you, for example, are passing rules that are implementing or influencing how users in that country are using the platform, or maybe you're even doing the crudest kind of rule, which is you're banning a service and app at the IP layer. The question to which, like, what percentage of users are then actually going to use VPNs, are going to be motivated, or they're going to relocate to domestic services or other types of services, right? But I think, yeah, there's a broader debate that's going on in the space around like internet fragmentation. And the question is, what happens when all these jurisdictions start imposing different rules? And then also if platforms start trying to scale those rules in different ways, right? So the thing that platforms generally like to do is they like to make the rule changes globally, rather than saying, okay, we need to have content-specific rules across jurisdictions, and if you're in a different jurisdiction and I send you a photo, it somehow gets lost in the middle because it's been moderated. I don't know. I think there's no easy answer. But yeah, no, actually, yeah, I'm I think it's interesting to look at the governance of VPNs.
I don't know where the mic is, but if you can pass it forward.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in understanding this characteristic of the platform, right? So I come from Australia, and we don't have the concept of a Bill of Rights. We don't have the idea of a protection of freedom of speech, right? So I'm interested in your research, if you came across how policymakers characterise these companies. Do they characterise them as a host, or do they characterise them as the publisher of information? The way I think about that is that, say if I run like a magazine stand, do they want the protections provided to like a magazine stand or as the magazine in itself, right? Because an example that comes to mind is that, you know, there've been a series of these book bans that have happened in the US. So, but if I, as an individual, if there were no copyrights issues, I posted the book as is on a Facebook post, is it less likely to be taken down because these protections somehow there's so much data gravity that these protections somehow will warrant like this extra layer that it's up to Facebook whether or not they remove it. So I'm interested in finding out how you think different policymakers have characterized these companies.
Well, it's also really interesting. Yeah, maybe I should go back. And I mean, I was looking at Australia in particular, so I would have to look back at some of those speeches and some of those internal documents, and you can maybe even compare what the civil society or the civil servants and the non-elected officials are saying versus, you know, the elected officials that are trying to signal to publics. In Australia specifically, I think it was a level of abstraction removed where it wasn't even saying publisher, it wasn't even saying host, it wasn't saying technical terms, it's just big tech. And, you know, and that kind of lets you maybe dodge that, that bullet a little bit. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I think it would be an interesting project to do like a comparative analysis of that in different countries and the language that different policymakers use. And like you say, there's a different valence, for example, to this publisher distinction in the US, because again, this is governed by legal frameworks in different places, intermediary liability. But yeah, interesting question, thank you.
So I will move now to the online questions. We have 3, but the 3 are asking you the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Which basically is asking you to reflect more on the capacities of the states to really regulate these actors. I will read you just the final one because it also includes some sort of reflections from Brazil. So it says, hello, congratulations for the talk and the book. I'm Elena Martins, a Brazilian professor and researcher, member of a project on platform regulation. I would like to ask Gorwa's opinion on the capacity of the states to drive the direction of regulation of this sector and your impacts about social regulation. Impacts, no, I think that is more like, and your thoughts about social regulation in a broad sense, as a French school approach, I guess, called
Regulation theory, yeah.
And also about markets. This is because it seems that the European Union has been one of the most successful state bodies attempting to hold platforms accountable, but its regulation is still essentially reactive.
Tough question. Yeah, I wish I had good and or easy answers to this. I think it's very much going to be a kind of wait and see situation. I think, you know, I wish I had more bandwidth to do more empirical research. So I have one chapter which is looking at a bunch of other countries that I didn't do the interviews in. So it's using more secondary material rather than primary material. And I did look at Brazil. And yeah, also just like a really interesting space, right? A strong history of internet, civil society, and technology policy, civil society. But then, you know, also arguably you're seeing very different firm state relationships, and at least around what's happening now, like a much more adversarial stance taken between companies. And I don't know whether it's just because they think that they can get away with it until they're waiting, basically. I guess in these kinds of jurisdictions where it isn't the EU and the US, you're much more likely to have like major showdowns, either through the legal system or through companies threatening exit. We've seen this kind of stuff happening in India. You know, there's really interesting showdowns between WhatsApp in India around encryption, around Twitter in India, where, you know, the offices of Twitter were raided. And I just think, I don't exactly know how that's going to pan out in the next couple of years. I think maybe one strategy that you're seeing, and this is probably not good, is that a lot of jurisdictions are basically saying, okay, we're going to copy the benchmark of the EU, right? Because at least there, that's like, if the platforms agreed to this in Europe more or less, maybe they didn't like it, but they're implementing these rules around the DSA or related laws, why not implement them globally? And there have been groups in various countries that I know of that are basically, lobbying their governments on this specific angle, saying, okay, we want these same kinds of rules to be transposed. Again, what does that mean from a democratic legitimacy and process standpoint? And what does that mean for countries that are trying to get culturally specific and nationally specific solutions that would fit their needs? It's a tough one.
I will follow up with a part of a question from here online, but I wanted to check first if anyone else has a question here, because after this follow-up, otherwise I will wrap up. Yeah. Mateo. It's for the online people.
I think there are two main communities right now talking about platform regulation. There's the content one and the competition one. So there are some critiques of tough content moderation on platforms, because it says that instead of decreasing the power of platform, actually it increases them, because it makes them basically unavoidable. It makes them actually very good points where the authorities can just knock the door and ask to take down content. So I was wondering whether in your fieldwork you found... My feeling is that when these laws were produced, there was no reflection whatsoever on the market impact of these laws. So basically, it was just... They were just thinking about safety. But I was wondering whether some of these legislators thought about the market impact, and whether there was also some communication between competition authorities or people actually thinking about, market power in more antitrust kind of way.
Yeah, hey, no, really good question, and I think you're completely right. And I think that's a valid critique. There's a scholarship on privatized enforcement, and basically the way that now, in a way, you're increasing the regulatory standards, but you're also more clearly delegating power basically to private entities, really big private entities. I think it's tricky. I would say it's clear, at least in the EU, that question of size and of market power has entered in some way, because you at least have now this category of the VLOP, or the FLOP, or the whatever you call it, the very large online platform. So they're starting to break down for the first time different requirements, regulatory requirements and responsibilities by size, with the idea that the biggest companies have to do more, and then this doesn't spur innovation. This arguably has maybe even happened in the earliest laws, like the NetzDG, where they also had thresholds for size, and there also were hot kind of negotiations around the definition of platform. And the definition of platform is so malleable that often as a policymaker you can craft it to exclude certain types of services if you want. But I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in looking more at the intersections of where things like the Digital Markets Act, the competition regulation, and the DSA kind of were interlinking and intersecting. It's clear that a key part of the strategy for lobbying and influence against these laws has been to make this kind of argument. And famously around the DMA, I think the largest 5 internet firms from the US created an organization called the Alliance for Startups, right, which then made startups-focused arguments against the DMA, saying that it was going to hurt the small and medium entrepreneurs. So these kinds of dynamics are definitely at play. But I don't know. I mean, I guess the problem is, unless you're completely changing the landscape of what platforms are, and you're going to decentralize platforms, and you're going to Mastodon, and we're all getting back into protocols, and we're going back to the Web 2.0 era before platforms in some way, then who else is going to do this work? And I guess structurally there is no good answer for that right now, and that's why we're just trying to, I understand why policymakers are doing this. But there's a real question. I mean, there's also, I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, but there's an interesting question of all the different weird stakeholders that are going to be empowered under this like new compliance industry, right? So there's audits now in a lot of these European laws, and who's going to do the audits? Probably the big 5 accounting and auditing firms, right? You know, so there's definitely interesting intersections there, but unless you manage to get like really kind of potentially explosive competition policy things like meaningful interoperability, I don't think we get past this privatized enforcement puzzle.
Okay, I think this was really the best possible ending, because it leads us to actually say, and a bit going back to Marisol's question, it is a bit about platforms and their specificity, but it's more generally about the structures of capitalism and all the things that need to be changed. And it's not that because we simply address the right way of regulating platforms, we're going to change the more general underlying structures and power relations. With this, I will just mention that I'm not going to ask you a follow-up question because, interestingly, it went towards the same direction as Mateo's question. So it spares us from that. And I just, as I wrap up, I want to invite you all to our next conversation, our next IIPP research seminar, which will be on May 21st, also at 4 p.m. And we will have Ana Carolina Cordila, who is currently teaching in Switzerland and France, but she is originally from Brazil. And she will be discussing her book on public health systems in the age of financialization, which precisely looks at 2 public health systems, the French one and the Brazilian one, and looking about how the systems, although they are public, they are financialized. So different topics, but again, towards the core of IIPP, of discussing discussing deep problems from an angle that is at the same time theoretical and practical and political. In this case, it was platforms. The next time will be healthcare, but both of them are among the things that we should be currently discussing more and more all the time to try to find solutions. So thanks all for coming. I hope we also have policymakers in the room and not only scholars, because I do think that we need to have also these conversations. And while you were talking and the questions were asked, I realized that in the future, maybe we need also to have a policymaker sitting here and giving comments to your book or things like that to make it even more interactive, because I think that your book is not only meaningful for us in general as scholars or for people in general, also echoing Marisol's words on how easy to read the book is, but also for policymakers to zoom out a little bit about their everyday work on how to regulate these companies from their countries. But really, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I know that, like, if you have a priority, you need to work on specific things sometimes. And this book enables them to get a comparative landscape and to go and to understand through your cases, even if their country is not considered, understand through the cases, get learnings and think of what they can also change from where they are. So thanks a lot, Robert. Thanks, Marisol. Thanks, everyone, for being here. And have a nice weekend.